I am Emma.
I'm JJ, and this is Lincoln. We are the Miser family.
Yep. Lincoln is 18 months old, and he has MPS-1. But he is the light of our lives, and he is so silly and smart, and he's just the best thing that ever happened to us.
How did you two meet and decide to start a family?
So JJ and I went to the same college. I'm originally from Michigan, but I fell in love with Miami University down here in Ohio. We got engaged in 2020, and we got married in 2021.
Can you share some of the emotions and thoughts you had when you first learned you were going to be parents?
I was excited.
I was very anxious. It happened much sooner than we were planning, and so
Much sooner than you were planning. Perfect timing for me. I would have had a baby 2 years earlier if I could have.
I was very nervous. I did not know what to expect going into it, and so very, very anxious.
I knew you would be the best dad ever, though, and you are.
Yeah, I wanted to be 30 before we had a baby, and I'm not 30 yet, so definitely way earlier than my initial plan.
I always wanted to be a young mom, and I'm how old? I'm 2.5 years younger than JJ. So when he said 30, I was like, well, maybe not. But I think I convinced him that we were in a good place to have a baby, and so when we kind of decided we were ready, it kind of happened right away. But I was so excited. Yeah. And you came around to it.
I came around quickly.
Yeah.
Quickly, but not immediately. So.
Yep, so January 2023, we found out we were pregnant, and I remember running downstairs and telling JJ, and we hugged and cried, and we were so excited. And then I think I ended up in the hospital the next week from severe nausea. It was not a fun pregnancy in the first, 20 weeks or so, but we were so excited, and all of the tests were, our ultrasounds were normal. We did genetic testing, everything came back normal. We found out he was a boy when I was about 12 weeks pregnant, so we already knew a name too, whether it was gonna be a boy or a girl. So once we found out it was a boy, we knew it was Lincoln. So yeah.
At what point did you learn that Lincoln would have a rare genetic disease?
Well, first, that second day after he was born in the hospital, we got the results that he had failed his hearing test. And so, we didn't think anything of it. They kind of said, sometimes that stuff clears up. We'll do another test in a week. So we went back to audiology the next week. We did our hearing test that morning, and we got home, and that afternoon we got a call from Children's thinking, it was just the results of the hearing test from that morning. And we're shocked and devastated to, get the news from the geneticist that Lincoln was diagnosed with something called MPS-1. And so, we were devastated. Emma's family was in Michigan. They came down to be with us. My parents came over to be with us, and it hit us like a brick. We were just not expecting anything like that.
How was the diagnosis made? Was it prenatal tests, newborn screenings, etc.?
Lincoln was diagnosed with newborn screening, which we're very fortunate to have here in Ohio because not every state has that.
Yeah, that's probably the darkest day of my entire life. And the genetic counselor basically said it's a very rare disease, and without treatment, the children only live until they're about 5 to 10 years old.
I was almost in disbelief that, something like that could have happened, that, any embryonic screening we did or in utero screening, none of that showed anything. So, I was shocked. I was devastated, and I knew that Emma would take it harder. And so I knew that I needed to be there for Lincoln and for her. while she sort of went through her range of emotions, I knew I was going to need to be the caregiver in that moment. And so my brain just immediately switched to, survival. I'm going to do this, this, and this right now while you can do your immediate grieving and I can, take care of us.
Everything went blank. I threw my phone across the room while the lady was still on the phone. And my mom had to go pick it up and talk to her because I couldn't breathe. I had to give Lincoln to JJ because I already deal with anxiety and I had a full-on panic attack. Like everything went black. I couldn't breathe. It was terrible. And I think, in that moment they tell you, there are treatments available, but you don't have all the information. So you're just left with a phone call saying your child has a terminal illness. It's our first baby. We just went through the last week of thinking he could potentially be deaf, find out he's not deaf, and then he has a terminal illness.
I almost just shut down at that point. It's really hard for me to remember that. It's just kind of memory hold. Just because I almost don't even want to think about how painful it was. I just took Lincoln and I held him and I just sat there with him and cried while she cried and cried. And we just sat there and just cried and cried and cried for hours.
I mean, my heart was just broken. I think I was literally holding my baby and grieving him. I was grieving the life that we envisioned for him. Is he ever going to go to college? Is he ever going to get married? Is he ever going to be a dad? Everything that we envisioned for him completely went away in that second. And even though he was still alive in our arms, we were grieving him. And that's the hardest part of it, is not knowing. And I guess none of us ever know. We never know if we're going to be here tomorrow. But you never think of those things. And you don't want your child to ever suffer. So I think from that day forward, at least for a little while until we had more answers, it was just grieving. It really was. And I remember they said, don't Google it. And it's hard not to. I did follow that for maybe 3 or 4 days. And I remember my mom would say, God's got this. It's going to be okay. If we have to get him a bone marrow transplant, we're going to do that. And in my mind, I was like, a bone marrow transplant? What are you talking about? And I thought maybe she was just throwing some extreme thing out there, just as an example. Come to find out, that is the treatment. So yeah, I think, when I did look it up on Google, you see, I think the first thing that pops up is a picture of an untreated child or an untreated adult. And I just remember crying. My baby's going to get made fun of. He's going to look like this. He's not going to be accepted. He's not going to be able to play sports or, do these things. I didn't even know if he would be able to go to school because along with that picture is points to everything of the physical abnormalities, and then the other thing, it said mental retardation. So in my mind, I'm like, is he even going to be able to go to school? Like, is he going to have a life?
Can you describe the treatments and interventions that Lincoln is currently undergoing?
Yeah, so when Lincoln was 5 weeks old, he started ERT, which is enzyme replacement therapy. And he did that for about two months or so. And then when he was 3 months old, we were admitted to undergo his bone marrow transplant. So he had a transplant, and it went as well as it could go. His doctor said he had a few scary times there. After transplant, his body was just working so hard and he had a hard time breathing on his own. We were sent to the PICU.
Going in initially, it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. You've got this sweet little, at the time he's not even 3 months old and we're admitted for his bone marrow transplant. And just, having to go there knowing that he's going to have the worst week of his 3-month-old life. And then he's going to have the worst week of his 3-month-old life after that week for the next several weeks. It just breaks you. It's just awful. and you're just there, and it's awful every day until it's not.
We went home, and then, yeah, it's 2 to 3 appointments a week, constantly getting blood drawn, all of that. Lots of medications. I think we went home on like 12 medications. And one of the medications, cyclosporin, which is the anti-rejection med, really hurt his kidneys. So he was having issues with his kidneys. His sodium levels were dipping, which can cause seizures. So he was then given, we had to literally just give him salt water to keep his sodium up. And he had blockages in his kidneys. They thought maybe he would have to have kidney surgery. Thankfully, as time went on and we decreased the cyclosporin dose and he was off of it, things kind of recovered and got better.
Since Lincoln's been born, we've had an appointment every week of his life. Those first ones were the screenings, the additional tests, and then immediately we went into that enzyme therapy, which held us all the way through transplant. We were in the hospital for 6 weeks of transplant, and then multiple appointments a week back down to Children's for several weeks after. And then even when we were done at Children's, he's had in-home PT, in-home OT, and in-home speech therapy, which he's just now finally graduated out of most of those. And going forward, he'll still have that weekly PT for the next couple months. So hopefully here soon, we'll have some weeks without appointments.
He was 11 months old. He's off of all of his medications. I see he has a huge lump, I guess, a huge bump on his groin, and I know it's a hernia. You know, hernias are kind of common-ish, but especially in MPS-1, that is a very common symptom. So we had an ultrasound done, and they said they didn't see anything, but I knew there was something there. So, time went on, and we continuously were seeing that bump, and so I was like, what is going on? But, they did an ultrasound, they didn't see anything, so it must just be his anatomy, I guess. And then one day in November, he is just screaming in pain. He's holding his diaper. He is just, it's bulging on both sides now. Like, I know this is something. So we took him to the emergency room, and they confirmed, yes, he has a hernia. So it wasn't an emergency surgery because they were able to push it back in, but it was going that way. But they admitted us, and 2 days later he had surgery. And the surgeon said, maybe there's 2, maybe there's just 1. We don't know for sure, but we don't want to cut him twice. So we're just gonna do the one side. So he recovered from that, and then about a month later, he had two hernias all along. So in December, right before Christmas, he had a second hernia surgery.
How did you go about finding the right medical care and specialists for Lincoln's condition?
We're very fortunate to be here in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is one of the centers of treatment in newborns for MPS1. So we were lucky to have everything right here. We didn't have to travel. It's just a 30-minute drive down the road to get him everything he needed. Lincoln was born at Christ Hospital, so they did the newborn screening there. And then when he did his audiology and they sent all his blood work, that all goes to Children's, just because pretty much every child in the Cincinnati area is in the Cincinnati Children's Hospital system, is where they all go. That's where our pediatrician would have been, even if we had not been diagnosed with MPS1. So we were just kind of ushered to Children's. We met with Lisa Berry, the geneticist, who, it's hard to say reassuring, because it's very hard to be reassured when you get a diagnosis like this. But, being told that everything we would need was right here at home, it was really important and helpful for us to get through those early stages, being able to be here.
Have there been any significant medical milestones or setbacks in your journey?
I think we got through transplant, which was the biggest, scariest, hardest thing we've ever done in our entire lives. And then his kidneys kind of took a hit from the medication that he was on. So we were back in the hospital about a month after we were out from transplant. So that was definitely a setback. You know, it's kind of crazy because when we were there for the 6 weeks during transplant, you'd think that those rooms would like trigger something going back. You know, JJ and I watched a TV show during transplant week, you know, while he was sleeping just to pass the time. And it was Daisy Jones and the Six. It had music in it, yeah. And months after transplant, I was driving home from work and one of the songs came on and it triggered something in me, like PTSD. I had to pull over. I started feeling panicky. It's really crazy, like just certain things really trigger you that take you back to transplant days. Even when, you know, it's been months, he's doing great. But strangely enough, going back to be admitted on the bone marrow transplant floor was somewhat comforting. It's very odd. I think, you know, those 6 weeks you're there, you have nothing to do except be there for your child. Everything on the outside doesn't exist. You're in that not hotel room, you're in the hospital room, and you just pray every single second your child's gonna make it through. Like nothing else matters. And it's like a time warp when you're in the hospital. 6 weeks felt like 2 days and a year at the same time. And all the nurses, the doctors, they were just so kind and caring and compassionate that going back on that floor a month later for an unrelated thing, you know, what can be worse than transplant, right? Like it's a scary thing what he's going through, and they didn't really have answers of why his sodium was dropping initially, so there's a lot of unknowns, but it was at the same time kind of comforting being back there. It almost felt like a home. We had lived there for 6 weeks. Do I want to be there now? No, of course not. But every time we have had to go back there, we have a sense of peace because everyone that had a hand in taking care of him was just so great. And we know that they're going to continue taking care of him, doing everything they can.
How much of that was like a sigh of relief that you know he's in pain, know he's hurting, but you're going back there to a place that you're familiar with, knowing that you're not doing this alone?
Yeah. I think that the first time he was admitted after transplant, it was because his sodium levels were so low and he was at risk of seizures, but he wasn't sick. He wasn't in there for surgery. He wasn't in there for any sort of treatment. It was literally just, hey, let's go hang out at the hospital just to monitor you until your sodium levels go back up. So that time, we didn't have anything to be afraid of. Of course we were afraid, but nothing can compare to what we had just gone through with transplant. So it's kind of like, hey, we get to go hang out. We don't have to cook dinner. We can, you know, get the meal sent to our room and we can just play with our baby. Because that's really what it was. We didn't go to work that week, of course. We were with him, but he was doing so well and there wasn't anything, you know, major going on. And so we were just able to play with him and just spend time with him in that comfortable space. So it's very odd. You would think that you would never want to go back to that floor, but that's at least how I experienced it. I think JJ experienced it a little bit differently, but yeah.
Now the milestones are just shedding those appointments, and we get to focus on, you know, the milestones that every parent gets to focus on for right now. And I think we really enjoy that, and it's been a huge relief just to set our sight on those.
Went from 3-time-a-week appointments to 2 to 1 to monthly, and now we're on every 3 months. We have our bone marrow transplant appointment where they draw blood, and he doesn't have a central line anymore, so that means sticking him, and that's very hard, especially as he gets older and he's aware of what's going on.
What are some of the day-to-day challenges that your family faces because of this disease?
Right now, it's just the biggest challenge is just a lot of appointments. You know, we're kind of coming into the tail end of the regular appointments, luckily, to where they're spaced out. We're about 3 months apart right now, and then eventually it'll go 6-9 months a year. But early on, it was just, you know, a drudge of appointments every day, twice a week, 3 times a week. And, right now I think we're very fortunate to be in a good spot where we're through the transplant, through the daily appointments. He just graduated his in-home PT, but we still have to go to outpatient PT. So it's still a challenge, to make time for that when we're both working full time. Another big challenge for us has been childcare. One of the big things with the bone marrow transplant is you can't get vaccinated. So any plans of daycare were out the window. Fortunately, we have family here who can help. And we're very fortunate for that. And so just those have been our biggest challenges, not on the medical side. On the medical side, Lincoln had some kidney issues following transplant that kept us going back to the hospital even more frequently than we would have been. But again, those have kind of subsided right now. So we're in a good spot right now before the other typical orthopedic issues come into play.
How has Lincoln's condition affected your family's daily routine and dynamics?
I think the very first thing going back, when we found out he had to have a bone marrow transplant, you automatically know that's like a $500,000 to $2 million procedure. Insurance in America is quite scary, and we both have full-time jobs. We both have great insurance, but that doesn't mean anything. And so we immediately assumed insurance may only pick up some of it. So before we had all the information, we kind of decided like we need to move into JJ's parents' house, because we know that with him being immune compromised, he's not gonna be able to go to daycare after. So we need help. Both of us work. Obviously, if we needed to quit, one of us needed to quit a job, we would have. But, we're a young couple. We want to be able to own a house one day. We want to be able to raise a family. And so, we had this huge financial burden weighing over us. And so immediately we moved into JJ's parents' house. And that's hard, We had been married already for 4 years. We've lived together for more than 4 years. No one wants to live with their parents, once they're adults and out on their own and married. That's regressing. Like we're so grateful that they were able to do that for us. But in the grand scheme of things, that's hard. That was really hard on my mental health, on JJ's mental health. So thankfully, after, transplant, we were able to rent a house that was close to JJ's parents so that we could still get the help from them, but that we could have our independence, we could have our own space as a family to grow. But, that was a huge life change for us. And then since, he has several appointments a week. I'm an engineer, so my job is very hands-on and in person. And I had to essentially tell my job, like, hey, if I can continue working here, that would be awesome. But he has multiple appointments a week that I'm just not going to miss. I'm not willing to miss them. One thing that is absolutely amazing and I'm very lucky for is JJ has not missed a single appointment with me. He was there every single day, every single night through transplant. And I know that's very hard for a lot of families to do. One couple or one, spouse has to work or take care of another child. But since Lincoln's our first child, we didn't have, another child to take care of. And so he was with me the entire time. And I could have easily said, well, JJ can take, Lincoln to all of his appointments and I can just go to work, but I needed to be there. I needed to be there. So, I was, thankful enough to have a hybrid schedule through my job. They allowed me to work from home 2 of the days when he had appointments. But yeah, JJ's work had to be flexible. My work had to be flexible. Even asking our families, hey, if you want to visit, you need to be wearing a mask for 2 weeks in advance. He's immune compromised. It would also happen to be in the winter months. We were in a bubble. We were in an isolation completely, even more restricted than COVID, I would say. So, we were probably very strict, but we didn't want to take any chances. We didn't want to risk it. So Anybody who's coming to the house had to be masked. If they were staying like a long weekend, they had to be masked 2 weeks in advance. They had to make sure they were not sick, even with sniffles. It's hard asking your family to do that, right? But they're, of course, willing to do it.
Are there any specific moments or events that stand out as particularly challenging or rewarding?
I think the most rewarding right now is just seeing him hit those every day, every baby milestones. He took his first steps just a few days ago, and it felt like we had come such a long way from where we started, and it was just such a relief to see him finally do that, and just going forward, getting to focus on that kind of stuff. I think that's been the most rewarding, is just moving through everything and getting to the stuff that I think we expected from the outset, and just that becomes so much more special now, because it's we don't take it for granted, because it's not a given with this disease that he has, and so it makes those types of milestones extra special.
Yeah, we were in isolation for essentially a year after transplant, and we got to take him to the zoo, and that was the biggest thing ever, because it's like we didn't know if we would even make it past transplant, and now we get to go see the animals, and he knows his animal sounds, and he loves pointing at the animals and laughing, and it's just such a big moment for us to be able to go out and experience normal things as a family. So yeah, that's been really great, and he loves people, and it's crazy because he doesn't see people ever for an entire year, and now that we get to take him out in public, he's waving to everyone, giving them kisses, like blowing kisses, and he's just
loves the fist bump.
Fist bumps. He's just the happiest person, and just is so joyful and loves being out. It's really great to experience that. He never will remember transplant. He will never have to remember going through that. But we know that as he gets older, there will be medical, challenges that he'll have to go through. But it's still so amazing how these kids are just so resilient, and it definitely gives us, strength. Like, we look up to him, and it's like, why are we complaining about these little things, when he finds joy going through everything he's had to go through.
What was your feeling whenever they were discharging and you knew that you were going to be able to walk out of that room, walk out of that hospital, and take your baby home?
I think it was both very exciting and very scary. Yeah. Just because, he went into the hospital at 3 months old. So we barely had time to be parents before we were in the hospital. So, it's almost like coming home with a newborn baby. You're so anxious about everything. You're so anxious because everything is there for you in the hospital. Yeah. If anything goes wrong, you are there, and it gets taken care of immediately. Not even just that, but you're not cooking, you're not cleaning, you're not living a normal life. You're there in one room where everything is given to you, and everything is there if you need it. And so, that was really scary leaving that, but it was so exciting to be on to the next chapter. Yeah. And because 6 weeks is the minimum stay for a bone marrow transplant. And we were very fortunate that we were able to leave 6 weeks to the day. And so just to know where he was in the process, and that they felt comfortable with him, going home at the bare minimum stay, I think that gave us a lot of confidence. Yeah. And was just such a huge relief to help allay some of the fears, that we both had leaving.
Yeah, I remember asking his doctors, like, are you sure? Are you sure we can go home? You sure? And they felt confident that, he's in a good place. His numbers are good. He's through the hardest parts of transplant. He was weaned from his, pain meds. So we really didn't need to go home on anything other than his, 12 medications that were related to, just prophylactics and anti-rejection meds and just all of those things. But he wasn't on pain meds anymore. So there was really nothing keeping us in the hospital. And I remember when we leave the floor, all of the nurses kind of make a tunnel and they bring out the big bell. And we were just crying happy tears. It's a celebration, and they sing, a song. And of course he's in his little car seat with like the bubble, completely unaware, but it's just, he made it. I think the hardest part for any parent going through this is not knowing if their child's going to make it. And unfortunately, there have been several children this year alone that have not made it through transplant. And it's heartbreaking. And yeah, there's survivor's guilt too, of course. It's like, we are so grateful our baby boy made it through, but then we cry along with the families that don't make it. Yeah, it's hard, but our boy made it through and he's thriving now. But it's not something that any parent should ever have to go through, that they should never ever have to see their child go through that. We need better treatment options, and we need a cure, because no child should ever have to go through any of the things that our babies have to go through.
How has this experience affected your emotional and mental well-being as parents?
Yeah, it's been a journey. We were both in therapy. Cincinnati Children's offers parents of children going through health issues like that therapy free of charge, which was a huge blessing. So while we were in the hospital, both of us saw a therapist once a week, more if needed. They were always there for us. And then when we were back home, they continued to see us for an entire year, free of charge whenever, he had his appointments every single Friday. So we would meet with our therapist every single Friday. So that was a huge, therapy is expensive, whether you have insurance or not. So that was a huge thing, because, I want to say that even if they didn't cover it, we would still do it. But it's like weighing the pros and cons. But yeah, both of us being in therapy was good, because we were able to help or talk, about what we're going through. JJ and I cope differently. So it was good for both of us to be able to talk that through with someone who was a professional. But it's still a challenge, it's every single day, even if it's only for 5 seconds, you have that thought, how long do I have? How long does he have? Is he gonna need hip surgery in 5 years? Is he, gonna need spine surgery in 7 years? It's always something every single day. Even on the great days where we are just living life, having fun, he's growing and playing and reading and just doing all of the normal baby stuff. There's never a single day that goes by where it doesn't just even for a second pass your mind, he's living with a terminal illness.
It was hard. I think I was able to just become laser focused on what needed to be done. And when I needed a break, I was working remotely from the hospital. And so it's weird to think of work as an escape from something. But when I needed a break, I was able to, log on to work for a couple hours and just kind of move my thoughts and my brain elsewhere. And just take, I was still in the room with Lincoln and Emma. So, it wasn't a complete break, but I was able to, focus on email, put my headphones in, and just get, a solid 30 minutes to an hour to just kind of let everything else wash away as best you can in that situation. But when it's not that hour and it's the middle of the night, and it's just hard. But, Lincoln had to lay on my chest the entire time we were in the hospital. And so, being able to just be there and hold him, that's some good that can wash away a lot of the bad.
Have you received support from family, friends, or support groups? And how has this support impacted your journey?
We've received, a ton of support from everyone in our life.
Yeah.
We started a Facebook page for Lincoln immediately, just to keep, close family and friends updated on what's going on. And there's just tons of support messages we get from them. Every time, it started out with just all the medical posts, and now it just gets to be those, milestone life posts. So seeing all the support there is great. My dad has been great. He, quit his job to help stay home and take care of Lincoln because he can't go to daycare. So I don't know what we would have done without that. One of us probably would have had to quit our job to stay home.
But it's so important for us to both be working right now because we do have goals to own a house. We have goals to, have another baby and just be a family, Those are things that we've always dreamed of. And, I would have loved to be a stay-at-home mom, but it's just not really in the cards for us. And so JJ's dad has been a huge help. Just being able to watch Lincoln during the day while we're working. My family's up in Michigan, but they come down literally like almost every other weekend to visit. And, they're there FaceTiming every single day. Our friends have supported, our works have supported.
Yeah, but I mean, both my parents, they took our dog in while we had to go stay in the hospital. They took us in for that time, post-diagnosis to where, it probably wasn't great for us to be on our own.
Yeah, and I think the MPS-1 just community, we're friends with a lot of the other parents on Facebook, and, we've only met a handful so far because we were in isolation, so meeting that was mostly at appointments at the hospital, of course, but, just seeing their children doing everyday things, going to school, playing their sports, it just gave us a lot of hope and strength, like we're gonna get through this and Lincoln is gonna have a childhood. So yeah, we found, a lot of community with other parents going through the same thing, and they understand everything. We don't have to explain it, they just know. So that's been really great. And we went through transplant with 2 other families at the same time. So that was, we never want to be in this situation. We wish we never had to meet these families because, that would mean our children didn't have this disease. But we are in this boat, and so being able to go through it together at the same time was really nice.
How do you cope with the stress and emotional toll of Lincoln's condition?
For me personally, I have a very strong faith, and I pray constantly. That's really the only thing that gets me through. When I do have those thoughts of how long does he have, what's what's the future for him, what does that look like, I immediately turn to prayer because that's the only time I truly get some sort of peace. Um, I know JJ copes a lot differently, and it is nice for us to talk, together about it. But also something we do, which we've done from day one getting the diagnosis, is when we do have those fears, we turn to other families. We go to the Kennedy Ladd Foundation social media pages, and we see, these kids, they're living life, they're laughing, they're happy, they're playing. It's scary, but they're fighters, they're resilient, and we just have to treat Lincoln like any other kid. Yes, he might have some limitations as he grows, but we just have to foster what his interests are. We have to just do everything we can to ensure that he is happy. So the community has been a big help, and yeah, prayer, I would say those are the 2 biggest things for me.
Have you become involved in any advocacy or awareness efforts related to Lincoln's condition?
Emma's been a lot better than I have personally about that. She has set up a Facebook group for Lincoln. She made these shirts. But now, that Lincoln is getting vaccinated and can go out in the world, we're able to start doing more than just posting on social media and that kind of stuff. So we haven't been a ton into it, but we are hoping to do more here going forward.
What do you think the public should know about families dealing with rare genetic disease?
I think the biggest thing is that just because they're rare doesn't mean they're any less deserving of scientific advancements for better treatment options for cures. No, they don't have cancer, but they still have a very life-limiting disease that impacts every single part of their body. And I know a lot of the funding for these rare diseases comes from the families, comes from fundraisers, all of that. And so, I wish there was more funding from the government. But they are lives, they're beautiful lives. Just looking at any kid with MPS-1, they always have smiles on their faces. They're the kindest, sweetest souls, and they deserve people to be fighting for them. And it's not just MPS-1, it's any rare disease. Rare disease actually impacts a whole lot more of people than people think. It's, I think, 1 in 10, I don't know that number for sure, maybe 1 in 10. But it's really all around you, even if you can't see it. And I think that's really important to remember, is that you never know what someone else is going through. Just because they look okay doesn't mean that they are. And so being kind to everyone is really the biggest thing I can say. You just never know what anyone's going through. And even, JJ and I aren't living with MPS-1, but our child has it, and we carry all of the burdens that come with it. And so being kind to us too, being kind to every single person that you meet, it's so important.
Okay. If you could give advice to other parents in similar situations, what would you say?
Focus on the positive. It's very easy to get bogged down in the negative, and it happens to everyone going through this, pretty much all the time. But what I really try to focus on is being present and grounded when I'm with Lincoln, and then that's what helps get me through this, is just being with him, just seeing everything that he can do, and just focusing on the positive and not in the here and now, and not as much on the long term, what's coming. Just focus on getting to be with him here, and in doing things with him.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is not focusing on the future, because it's so easy to assume. MPS-1 is different for a lot of kids, but there's a lot of the same, usually a spine surgery, a hip surgery, a knee surgery, issues with the heart, the lungs. And so it's very easy to just assume that those issues are going to rise in your child, but that's not necessarily true. And so, yes, we need to not be naive and think that it's not going to happen to our son. But the reality is, he's his own individual, and he might not need some of those surgeries. And so instead of being fearful of them, we just need to celebrate where he is now and just live every day. When we were newly diagnosed, we were both in the darkest days of our lives. And I would just tell newly diagnosed parents and families that it's going to be okay. Your child is beautiful and worth it, and you're going to find a way. We're going to get through it. And, there's a community out there of parents and other families that know what you're going through. It's hard at first. At first I didn't want to connect to anyone because I didn't want to see their kids going through what they're going through. I wanted to kind of just stay in that bubble. But it is important to connect with others. We're a great support system, and I hope that if there is a newly diagnosed family, that they feel comfortable reaching out to us, because that's what helped us when we were newly diagnosed. The only thing that gave me hope was seeing the Kennedy Ladd Foundation, seeing the kids playing outside, going to school, those were so many things we didn't have answers to. And just seeing that they're living a life, they're smiling, they're happy. That's the only thing. When I got in my, darkest moments, I would go on my phone and I would look that up, because you just have to have hope that there's a future for your child. And there is.
What are your hopes and dreams for Lincoln's future?
I hope that he is happy. And obviously we all pray for a cure, right? We want a cure. We want them to be able to grow up without the fear of anything. We don't want them to be in pain. We don't want them to have to go through all of these surgeries. We want them to just live their life. And, if a cure doesn't come, I just pray that he always knows that he is made perfectly, and he is worthy, and he is special, and he's loved. And I just hope that we can give him, the happiest life, and do everything we can to fight for him and give him, everything that he could want, not like spoiled, but, just nurture his passions. I want him to be able to follow his interests, and whatever that may look like, just supporting him. But of course, the hope is that there is a cure soon, where it actually does something for him. Because none of these kids deserve to go through the countless surgeries, the pain, the fight every single day, and yet they still do it with a smile on their face.